said, well, he must be dead. Let's make an idol, right? So they immediately make an idol. They start worshiping that idol, and they break the covenant before they even really receive the covenant. Like it's just so quick how quickly they are to sin against God and to forsake him. And God, understandably, is angry. The tablets get broken, and God wants to wipe them out. And Moses, at the end of chapter 33, has this conversation with God and pleads with him to have mercy. And so now we start in chapter 34, and in verse 1 it says, "The Lord said to Moses, 'Cut for yourself 2 tablets of stone like the first, and I will write on the tablets the words that were on the first tablets, which you broke. Be ready by the morning, and come up in the morning to Mount Sinai, and present yourself there to me on the top of the mountain.'" So verse 2 I think is interesting because that's the only time that I'm aware of, that I can think of, maybe you can think of others, where God gave somebody a deadline. And I was just thinking about how stressed I am with deadlines. And if I've got something, last night I'm thinking about teaching this class, and I woke up early this morning to study for it more and those sort of things. And I have this deadline, right? I can't miss it. I've got to teach class. Nobody else is going to be able to teach class for me. My thoughts were with Moses of like, man, I've got to make these tablets perfect by in the morning. If I don't, I can't have any excuses. I got to be ready with these tablets. Verse 3, "No one shall come up with you, and let no one be seen throughout all the mountain. Let no flocks or herds graze opposite that mountain." So Moses cut 2 tablets of stone like the first, and he rose early in the morning and went up to Mount Sinai, as the Lord had commanded him, and took in his hand 2 tablets of stone. The Lord descended in the cloud and stood with him there and proclaimed the name of the Lord. The Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgressions and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and their children's children to the 3rd and 4th generation. And Moses quickly bowed his head toward the earth and worshipped, and he said, "If now I have found favor in your sight, O Lord, please let the Lord go in the midst of us, for it is a stiff-necked people, and pardon our iniquity and our sin, and take us for your inheritance." Excuse me, I've got a scratchy throat this morning. So we see that the Israelites here immediately sinned against God. Moses broke the tablets. He pleads with God to have mercy, and God says, all right, come back on the mountain, we'll make some more tablets, I'll give you the law again, and I will make this covenant. And God starts talking about who he is as a God, as a being. And so in verse 6 and 7 is where we're going to spend most of our time here. The Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfastness. So he starts out with mercy. That's the leading characteristic that God chooses to tell us about himself. So somebody define mercy. Unmerited favor? Well, that's actually grace. So the difference is mercy is I have done something and I deserve some kind of punishment. I deserve some kind of justice. And then mercy says, I'm going to take that punishment. I'm not going to give you that punishment that you deserve. And then grace, you're right, is unmerited favor, right? Grace is, I don't deserve this thing, and then God's going to give us something that we don't deserve. Does that make sense, the difference between those two things? And so here we're talking about mercy. We're talking about, what do the children of Israel deserve? Death. They deserve death. They deserve the punishment that God was going to give them. He was going to wipe them out. He was going to make a new people through Moses. And but he has mercy here. And so he was slow to give that punishment. He heard Moses, he thought about it, and he said, you know what, I'm not going to do that. But then at the end here, in verse 7, it says, keeping steadfast love, transgression, and sin, and he has this contrast, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children to the 3rd and 4th generation. So what quality of God does that talk about there? He doesn't say the actual word, but What word do we have a whole system of government that the job of that system of government is to figure out whether somebody is guilty or innocent and then decide the punishment that those people get. Justice, right? Yeah. So it's so important to us in our life, in our world, that we have devoted a whole system to this, right? That's the job that this system does, is figure out what's just and unjust and then direct punishment on that. And God is just, right? God is ultimately just, and he is fair, and he understands what's right and wrong. He's the arbiter of what's right and wrong. And so there's this tension between these two things, right? Because if he leads with this characteristic of mercy, and he's a merciful God, but he's also a just God, how do those two things work together? How do those two things play out, at least in this story? So the Israelites deserved death. They deserved to be cut off. And yet, what did mercy do for them? Mercy said, I'm going to make another covenant with you. I'm going to keep going with this. I'm not going to destroy all of you. Now, there was punishment. 3,000 men were put to death because of this. There was punishment, but there was also mercy that came with it. There could have been more punishment that came with this thing. And so I just find it interesting, the tension between those two qualities of God, because it's not always straightforward. And we see this in our life a lot. And forgive me for bringing up politics, but I think that I think it's very meaningful in this story in the way that we think about things. And so don't take any of this as passing judgment on one side or the other, but I'm describing what I think is somewhat objective opinion about these two groups of people. So if you look at Republicans, we've got two parties in our system. We've got Republicans and we've got Democrats. And at least in the near term, within the last 10, 15, 20, 30 years, the Republicans have talked about justice, right? We see things like rioting happen, and we say, we need to put down those riots. We need to get rid of that, and there needs to be justice for crimes that happen. We talk about immigrants, coming into the country illegally and not following the rules. That's a crime. There needs to be justice for those crimes. We need to take care of that. We need to make sure we handle that and we stop that, right? And Democrats tend to talk about mercy. Well, the people that are coming into the country didn't have any other choice, and they're fleeing these horrible things, and they're trying to keep their families together, and they're trying to do all these things. We should have mercy on that. Yeah, maybe they broke the law, but we can have mercy on that. And there's these two kind of conflicting things that happen, and both of them are good. Both of them are right in the sense of mercy is a good thing, and justice is a good thing. But there's real tension between those two things. If you're ultimately just, it doesn't leave much room for mercy, right? If someone came into my house, and murdered Monica and the kids, and it was this horrible thing, and I went to court, we found that we knew who did it. I could see his face the whole time. I had camera footage. There was this awful thing that happened. He immediately got caught by the police, and then ever how long, we go to the judge, and the judge says, he did it. We've got proof that he did it. We've got the video. We've got DNA evidence. We have everything. There's no shadow of a doubt that this person is guilty. And then the judge says, but I'm going to let you go free. Well, how would I feel about that, right? I'm going to want justice for my family that this man destroyed. This man came in. And so I'm not going to want the judge to have mercy there. And we would all say, I think almost everybody in this room loves my wife and children similarly to how I do, and would say, that's not just. That's terrible, right? But on the other hand, there's times where we want mercy, right? If I'm that person that did that horrible thing, and even if I did a horrible thing, you think about, you're faced with the prospect of the penalty that might come with this. It could be death. And maybe there's extenuating circumstances. I was trying to feed my family, and I needed food, and they were hungry, and my kids were starving, and I needed to go steal, and it turned horrible, and I didn't mean to kill everybody, and blah, 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 whatever the things are. I'm going to want mercy for that thing. Please don't kill me. I shouldn't have done what I did, but I've repented and I don't, I feel sorry for that, all these sort of things. It's hard to have both of those at the exact same time. And yet, we have a God who is both merciful and just. And it's this amazing dichotomy that we have here. And we see that play out in the New Testament in the most beautiful way with Christ, right? And Romans, I think it's Romans, says that he's both just and the justifier, right? So he's both the epitome of justice, but he also is merciful and justifies us even when we don't deserve it. It's that we don't have the penalty that we have to take there. And so how does Jesus play this out in the New Testament? How is he both just and the justifier? The penalty got paid, right? Right. He's merciful because he took the penalty away from us, right? So I know this is an old kind of preacher thing, but going along with the courtroom scene where I've done some crime, I totally deserve to be put to death for this thing. But imagine that the judge says, you're guilty. And he smacks the hammer down and he says, we've got total evidence that you did this horrible crime. You're deserving of all these sort of things. And then he says, but I'm going to go to jail. I'm going to go take that punishment. And so there's still justice there because the crime got paid, right? It's similar to the Old Testament with the blood and bulls and goats, the sacrifices that were happening. Those sacrifices were payment for sin that was happening, real sin that was happening, real egregious things were happening against God, and those sacrifices, God took as payment for that thing. And the same with Jesus. Jesus was the perfect sacrifice. He said, you're guilty of these sins, but I'm going to pay the penalty here. And so he stepped down from heaven onto earth and got on the cross, having no sin, having no need for mercy himself, took that penalty, died on the cross, and he was merciful to us, right? And also gracious at the same time because we got this unmerited favor. And so I think it's really interesting to think about those qualities of God and think about how much as humans we tend to lean on one side or the other, right? I probably tend to lean a lot more towards the justice side naturally. That like when I hear about some crime or when I hear about something happening or see something on the news, it's like we need justice for that. This person needs to be put away or whatever penalty needs to be paid, right? And there's other people, there's other humans, and I think they're good people and have good motives that say, we've got to be mercy. We've got to have mercy for people, and there's people that are really struggling, and we need to help them, and we need to maybe overlook some of the things that they've done and be merciful to them. And both of those things can be true, but it rarely in humans do you find that tension in balance with each other. We tend to go one way or the other, and yet God found this perfect equilibrium point between those two things. And I find it so fascinating, and thinking about it that way, it almost feels paradoxical as a human because it's hard for us we think about it as this like linear scale, right? You've got justice over here and you've got mercy over here, and generally we're on one side or the other. And God is right there in that sweet spot, figuring both of those things out. He's both just and he's merciful. And it's more for him like a horseshoe where these two things are closer together instead of this linear scale here. You've got justice and mercy closer together here. And there's so many things about God that are paradoxical like that and yet absolutely true, right? Another one would be that when Jesus came to earth, he was fully man and fully God. I don't understand how that works, but it is. And he told us that he was. Any comments on justice and mercy? I think it's... I find it to be a really fascinating topic. Yes, ma'am. Right, right. And so, yeah, and you see that here. I mean, there's people that were put to death over this. It wasn't that he was just saying, don't worry about it, it's fine, right? There were real penalties. Let's talk about kind of this next thing that happens in here. Sure. So, well, and there's times where I've sinned on accident, but there's times where I've said, I know this is sin, I'm going to do it, right? And that may sound hard, Bible teachers not supposed to stand up here and say that, right? We're supposed to act like we're all good and perfect. But every single person in this room has sinned before and knew that they were sinning in that moment, right? They knew. And to me, that's more egregious than this accidental, man, I didn't realize that I did that thing. I'm sorry for that. As humans, we treat that differently, right? If I purposely hurt Monica by words, I'm not saying physical, but purposely, I'm going to say this thing because I know that it bothers her and I know that it'll cut just the right spot, and I do it on purpose just to injure her. That's so much worse than if I accidentally say something that hurts her, right? We treat that as worse. But both of those things, depending on the penitence of your heart, the way that you respond to those things can be forgiven by God and will be forgiven by God. Because we don't deserve to have either of them forgiven, whether it was a mistake or whether it was on purpose. Yes, definitely. And I hope I made that clear. God is perfectly just, right? There is justice for sin, whether it's through the sacrifice of Jesus Christ or whether it's through eternal damnation in hell. There is penalty for those things. And so let's talk about it in the concept of humans and with our children, right? Because I think we think about this concept a lot, or at least I do, and some people veer on one side of the spectrum and some people veer on the other. But when you say younger kids, right, 6, 7, 8, when they mess up, is your temptation to immediately punish them and deliver justice for that thing? I told you not to do this thing. You did it anyway. Even though you weren't paying attention, whatever the extenuating circumstances, no matter what, justice for this thing, right? You're getting a spanking, you're going to timeout, whatever you decide justice is for this penalty. And then you can go so far that way that you provoke your kids to all kinds of terrible things where they hate you. Not because you're unjust, but because you had no mercy whatsoever, right? And then there's also parents that go completely the other way where they have mercy on every single thing. And they really needed some more heaps of justice in there because the kids learn from both of those type things. I've been guilty of being too merciful with my kids and letting my kids do too many things and walk all over me. I've also been guilty at times for jumping down their throat immediately at the first sign of any kind of thing. And I probably bounce around between those two things. But what are the long-term effects of that? It feels good to be merciful a lot of times. It feels like I'm helping my kids out by being merciful. But if I do that all the time, what happens? You look like you want to say something.
Well, I'm breaking it down in my mind to a real simple thing, the lie. The first time a kid lies to their parents, when you think of the consequences of that, it may be a simple thing, but the first time a kid lies to the parent, outright, bald-faced, he lies. Think of the damage that does, the consequences that begin to heap on top of that. The next time you need the truth from your kid, and yet just consider the inordinate amount of time you'll spend trying to verify that what he said is the truth, whether you believe him or not.
Right.
You're spending all kinds of time and energy just trying to figure out whether he's shooting straight with you. The damage to sin, I think that's what it, when it says that God by no means overlooks the guilty, but he visits the iniquity on third and fourth generations. These consequences just pile up. Even though there may be grace and mercy involved in the equation, the consequences are so detrimental. And we have so much trouble getting that through our thick heads. I do.
Yeah.
I assume many other people do too, but boy, you'd think I'd have it down by now.
Right, yeah. Yeah, but if you take that example of this bold-faced lie, also, depending on how you deal with that bold-faced lie in that moment, changes the propensity for that child to do that again, right? And if you go too far on the justice side of things, he might do it to spite you, right? Like there's weird things that kids do that go, psychological things that happen all over the place. And it's super difficult to figure that kind of stuff out. But if you're super merciful and even though it was a bold-faced lie, you knew he did it on purpose, you know he did it to deceive, but you say, I'm going to let this one go. Well, what's going to happen next time? He's going to remember when he's trying to get out of whatever penalty that he's lying to gain something, right? That's what humans do. When we lie, it's generally because we want to gain something or avoid something, right? And so he's going to lie for that thing, and he remembers, well, there wasn't really a penalty for doing it last time, and I avoided this penalty for whatever I lied about, and so and it causes him to go more and more that way. But it's just interesting because if you're too far on the spectrum either way, it causes issues. And yet God figured it out perfectly and has this perfect innate character between grace and mercy, or mercy and justice. All right, so let's go on because Dave brought up this interesting kind of end of this verse 7 here, and let's talk about it. So in verse 7, he says, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgressions and sin. So he forgives iniquity, transgressions, and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children to the third and fourth generation. Man, John Calvin read this verse and was super excited about it, I'm sure, right? Like this feels like, when I first read this verse, I'm like, it sounds like these kids have the sin of their fathers. Does anybody disagree with that? Right. There's many other places in the Bible that disagree with that. So how can we interpret this verse here with that further understanding of the way God treats generations? How do we understand it in this context? Yeah, exactly. So just to give you a graphic example, let's say I have a bad night tonight and I decide I'm just going to get super drunk. And when I get super drunk, I'm going to go to Taco Bell because I love Taco Bell and it's delicious. So I'm going to drive my big, stupid Cybertruck down the road, drunk, I'm seeing multiple lines, I'm all over the place, and I cause some horrible accident and I die in the process. My kids had nothing to do with that. They bear no responsibility for that sin that I just caused there. And yet, what are the consequences on my kids? Lawsuits. They grow up without a father. There's the shame of knowing that your father drunk and drive and died in a car wreck. There's the shame of whatever, if it was a multi-car accident, whatever I caused on some other family. And by the way, that family had nothing to do with my sin either, and yet they've got consequences. At the very least, their car got tore up. At the very most, they lost a parent themselves or other kids, or there's death and all kinds of terrible things. There's property damage. There's all these sort of things that happen as a result of the sin. And those things can last for generations, right? I can imagine an effect on my kids if I were if I were not here on this earth anymore, even if it wasn't for drunk driving, even if it was just I wasn't here to father my children, there's going to be times where my children need me over the course of the years, and I'm not going to be there through no fault of their own, but it's going to shape their lives. It's going to change their lives in different ways. And that's just one example, but I mean, one obvious example from the Bible I think of is David, right? So we all know the story of David and Bathsheba and the sin that David looked on Bathsheba. He liked what he saw. He figured out how to make that happen where he could bring Bathsheba to his palace or whatever. And then she got pregnant. And then he spent all his time trying to figure out, how can I right this wrong, right? So we're going to bring Uriah back. Uriah's too much of a good soldier he sleeps outside his house. And so it becomes obvious, this is a real problem. I got to kill Uriah, right? And take Bathsheba for my own. And these sins just compound and compound. But in this moment, there's 3 people involved with this, right? There's David, there's Bathsheba, and there's Uriah, and then the baby. So 4 people. And the sin is kind of contained to that. Uriah gets killed because David puts him in the heat of the battle and they withdraw. And so David basically murders by proclamation Uriah. And then what happens to the baby? The baby dies. Well, the baby bore no sin of that. There's a big consequence of the baby. Now, I can't explain exactly all the intricacies of how that works or, God's feeling about that, but I know the baby died. That's an objective fact. The baby died, and it died because reasons that I don't really understand. What other consequences happened to David and his family because of his sin? Right. The prophet said the sword's never going to depart from your house, right? Do you think that was a direct punishment, or do you think that was ramifications of the thing that you've done? It's not for me to say, but it's an interesting question, I think. I tend to think it was probably a mix of both of those things. But you know that David's children were seeing these things play out. They were understanding more about their father when this happened, right? And, you have the whole Amnon and Tamar situation, where Amnon rapes Tamar and Tamar's life is ruined. Again, there's another sin. Tamar has a terrible life because of that, because of something that she had no control over. Amnon gets murdered by, I think it was Absalom, is that right? So Absalom takes vengeance on Amnon. Absalom flees, right? And then Absalom decides, my dad's a real idiot. I should be running this country. And so he mutinies, basically, or whatever the word is, and tries to take over the country. And there's this whole battle between Absalom and David, right? Or at least between Abner and all the other people there, all the soldiers. And so there's all this turmoil that happens from there, and yet we see Solomon. Solomon has spurts of greatness, right? He's smart enough to ask God for wisdom and not wealth, and wisest man on earth, and that's really, I think, the peak of Israel there, where the rest of the world holds Israel in high esteem. They were sending people to sit at Solomon's feet to understand more about him. And Solomon just had so much money that things were going super well. And yet, there's idol worship that comes from Solomon. And what happens with Solomon's 2 sons? You had Rehoboam and Jeroboam, right? Right. There's a split, so that's number 1. And what did Jeroboam do? Jeroboam set up idols. And maybe if you're thinking about it outside of God, you think, well, this makes sense. I'm in the north, right? And Rehoboam's in the south. And I'm going to set up these places for people to go to worship. I can't let them go worship in the south. They're just going to turn over to Rehoboam there. It's going to cause all kinds of problems for me. I'm going to let them worship here in, I can't remember the different place, Dan and Bethel, maybe? And so he set up altars at specific spots in the north. And what effects did that sin have on the rest of time, right? They basically never gave that up in the north. I mean, it took generations and generations and generations of this sin that Jeroboam did that caused all these kind of issues. And I think you can really take all of that back, all of that sin and all those generational turmoils and all the things that happened, all the way back to David's sin. Now, can you specifically draw that line and say, yes, this 100% happened because David and Bathsheba? No, but it caused all kinds of issues in their family and bred all kinds of contempt and problems and issues and things like that. And you can just see these like generational ripples that happen because of all those things. And I think that's what God's talking about here in verse 7. Visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children to the third and fourth generation. I think he's also trying to make a point that his mercy overcomes that. But I think he's talking about those ripple effects that happen because of sin. And I mean, you can see that in my life. I gave the example of if I were to drunk drive, but let's say I do something maybe a little less innocuous, right? Let's say that I decide that in my life it's more important for me to do all my hobbies or my job or all of those kind of things and not set an example of studying God's word or praying or worshiping God throughout the week, right? Maybe I come to church every Sunday, I come to church every Wednesday, but the rest of the time I'm really not thinking about God and I'm really not setting that example for my kids. And you know what? Sometimes that's true. And it's probably true for a lot of you. Well, what are the generational ripples that can come out of that? All kinds of things. Totally, right? Yeah, I mean, they act how they see. And how many times have you seen a kid and you're like, man, you are just like your dad. You got the mannerisms of your dad. You say the same kind of things. And I'm sure people that knew my dad probably say I have a lot of mannerisms and act in a lot of similar ways to my dad. Hopefully not all the ways that my dad acted. But there's a lot of things about my dad that you can see in me. And that happens with your children too, right? So, and maybe you say, well, I had a lot going on. I had all these problems. But there's these generational ripples that come from that sort of thing. In the same way, how often do you hear about people that are faithful because their grandfather was so faithful and that he was that example in their family and constantly serving God and constantly doing those things? There's ripples that way too, right? There's positive ripples that happen from that. And so I think that's what verse 7 here is talking about, is these ripples and these things that happen because of sin or goodness in your life. There's effects that happen. There's real effects from sin. Even if God says, I'm going to wipe the slate clean from a spiritual standpoint, and Jesus paid that sin on the cross, paid that debt on the cross, you still have earthly problems that arise because of those kind of things, right? If you have an adulterous relationship when you're in a marriage, you could be forgiven of that, but you can't get married again, and you, according to Jesus, right? And you might break up your family, and it might cause all kinds of problems with your kids, and it might cause all these sort of things. You can be right with God after having adultery. We believe that Jesus can save you. He can wash away your sins, and if you are repentant of that sin, he'll take that away. But it's not going to take away all the earthly consequences that can happen from that. There's all kinds of things that still happen in your life, and I think that's what he's talking about here. Any thoughts, comments, agree, disagree? Yeah. He was a man after God's own heart and he was a murderer, right? Like you said. He was an adulterer and a murderer and had all these terrible things that we tend to think are the worst sins, right? And yet he was described as a man after God's own heart. Why do you think that was? Right. It was his response to those things, right? It's not that he had sin. Every man has sins. It's the response to that sin, right? It's understanding that sin and then going to God and realizing you've got to lean on God and you need God's mercy for those things. That's why David was a man after God's own heart. It wasn't because he was perfect, and it wasn't because he always acted perfectly or did all the right things in all the right moments, because that certainly was not true. All right? The census is another one that we think about with David, and we don't tell that to kids all the time because it's not as gripping of a story as David and Bathsheba, but the census was directly disobeying God and saying, I want to understand the power of my army, so I can rely on my army and my power and my strength and not rely on God, right? It was basically spitting in God's face by doing that census. That's another one of the sins that he did. And there were all kinds of problems that came from that, right? With the Ark of the Covenant and things like that. People died because of that. Yes, sir.
You mentioned several times the phrase generational ripples. Then you specifically talked about the sins of Jeroboam. Okay? If you look later, there are probably 8 or 10 kings in the Old Testament that are specifically said to have followed in the sins of Jeroboam. So you can see it went on
Yeah.
many generations.
Yeah.
And it specifically said sins of
Right. And they didn't inherit his sins, but they decided to keep going. They let those ripples, they kept amplifying those ripples over time. All right, so wrapping up, again, God is ultimately merciful and ultimately just at the same time, right? And that's hard to think about, but I'm glad that he is. If he was just, it would be a real problem. We would all be dead. We would all go to hell, right? I'd maybe be okay with him being just merciful, because that would work out well for me, but all the people that have wronged me in some way, it also would work out well for them, right? So, but he's both. He's just and he's merciful. And I think that's very interesting. And then the things that we do still have consequences. Even if we receive that mercy from God, it ripples throughout generations. And so it's really important to consider the things that you do and try to be Christ-like and try to do the things that Christ would do, not just for yourself, not just for your own soul, but for your family and all the people around you. That's all I got. Thanks, everybody.